Utah's legislative session is upon us, and education policy always commands a lot of debate. So, what's on deck for this year?
The focus this year, I should say, is a lot on data. So I think that would be worthwhile.
This week, I sit down with Sutherland's education expert, Cooke Fairbanks, to get a preview of the education bills that state lawmakers will be debating. This is Defending Ideas.
Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas.
Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about getting geared up for the 2026 legislative session here in Utah. And education is often, in fact, I think always, a really high-profile issue for legislators. And we're going to dive into a lot of what's being proposed already as the session is right around the corner. To have this conversation, I'm excited to welcome into our virtual studio, back to the show, Cooke Fairbanks, our Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland. Christine, welcome back.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you for having me.
Christine, you wrote recently for the Sutherland Insights blog a really good explainer piece kind of profiling some of the education bills that are already slated to be discussed during the session this year. And I want to start with maybe, what do you think are the main themes? Like if you're just sort of giving someone an overview of when it comes to education policy in the session for 2026 in Utah, what are the key high-profile issues or topics that they're going to be discussing?
Yeah, like you mentioned, education is the one of the areas that has the most bills that you'll see listed online. It also is the big ticket item, the biggest price tag usually for the state. So there's just a lot going on, and it's kind of hard to consolidate sometimes what the themes are. But here's my best summary that we see so far. I would say technology and education is going to be a big one. There is this proposal to ban cell phones from bell to bell. So last year we saw that the legislature banned phones during class time, right? So when there's actual instruction, but this would go further than that, right? So not even in the hallways, not in home classroom or the extra periods where they don't have instruction time and things like that. So it's the full day. This is something that's listed on the House priorities page. The governor of Utah has spent a lot of time also strongly advocating for this and saying this is, the next step. And if Utah were to do this, they would be the first state to move in this direction. And that's actually really noteworthy. Utah is this state that is so pro technology. We invite a lot of those businesses to the state. We're at the cutting edge of the AI discussion, but also leading out on how do we protect our kids. So it's a really unique kind of niche that Utah has. And in a similar vein, there was a conference recently that looked at two other bills that would protect kids from technology. One is called the SAFE Act, and the other is called the Balance Act. And one sets a standard for approving software before it's used in class, and the other is to reduce unnecessary screen time. We understand that technology can be a really beneficial tool, but to make sure that it's not becoming kind of a crutch or something that we lean on too much, especially in the younger ages. So kind of looking at that balance, those I'm sure will be really lively, interesting discussions because again, Utah does embrace technology. There's even the state obviously has state standards, and digital literacy is one of those that kind of has strands and things you can go read online. But another legislator is proposing a digital literacy class or course as a requirement for graduation. And so I think that kind of just shows that, hey, we really want the students to understand the world they're living in. It tackles things like social media and AI and the world that these kids are already really just swimming in. So that would be a key one. Another would be literacy. There have been a lot of headlines about this, and this has been going on since, for a few years. But the NAEP scores of last year showed that while Utah's reading scores are a little bit above the national average, and that's typical, they're still down from the year before. They're down since COVID-19. And this is a national trend. Reading comprehension is down, and that's really concerning. Reading is how kids learn after about the third grade. Every kid's different, but that's kind of the rule of thumb there. And so as we see this slipping, that's a real big cause for concern. And again, this is something that the governor has really, shined a light on and is hoping to address. I know the legislature is also wanting to focus on this. So we see that chronic absenteeism, and sometimes I link these together because these are both issues that have worsened since COVID-19, right? Kids got into this habit of not going to school, and certainly being in class, sitting there and getting instruction from the teacher does have impacts on outcomes and test performance and things like that. So, there are a couple of bills that are working on data and chronic absenteeism. Um, Specifically beefing up like an attendance tracking, having tiered interventions, and annually looking at how those improve, and then also requiring the state board to aggregate data and share that. So, um, chronic absenteeism is like this is not a new thing. The legislature's been working on this for years, but I think everyone's still just trying to really narrow in on the root causes. How do we improve it? And there's always this concern, and I think it's completely valid about the volume of education bills, right? There's a lot of discussion about how do you expect districts and schools to comply if there's just an avalanche of requirements every year. But I will say that chronic absenteeism and reading are things that I believe do need public policy support and are worthy of consideration and moving in that direction. The final that I would say in the K-12 space, as always, would be kind of education choice. So the big Utah fits all scholarship debate is now in the courts, but that hasn't stopped legislators from kind of legislating in the space. I would say in less intense ways, but in particular, you see a couple of different bills that are seeking to decouple the scholarship from teacher salary. So if you remember, that was the really important compromise that the governor wanted to see before he would sign the education choice bill. It wasn't there were plenty of people that weren't a fan of that. And so these bills are trying to separate the two. One in particular just says it doesn't need to be attached to the operation of this program at all. And the other says, if litigation were to effectively get rid of the program, it doesn't impact the salary. So, those would be important. I think the other piece that I've been writing a lot about, if anyone's following Sutherland's work on education, is open enrollment. So often we focus on education choice as these programs, vouchers, tax credit scholarships. Those are very important. They've been nationally very splashy, and we've taken the time in Utah to debate them. But there are public choice options that are really important, like open enrollment, which is that you can transfer your kid between one district school to another district school. And just diving in, looking at this issue, we realize there's plenty of space for reform. A lot of the districts aren't sharing the data that's required by law. That data is useful for parents that are trying to understand if there's space available. It's useful for policymakers who are trying to see trends. And so a recommendation that Sutherland is really advancing is making sure that there's a state level reporting requirement. So specifically, that means that the State Board of Education would get this data from the LEAs or the districts and would aggregate it and host it on their data center, which has a lot of other information already: attendance, test scores, things like that. So it would make a lot of sense just to include that. So I would say those: technology, reading, choice. One other I will just put in, I know this will continue to be a discussion, especially after the horrific shooting this year at UVU. Campus safety, school safety. There's a couple of bills aimed at assessing risk for public speakers at universities and things like that. So there's definitely a lot going on in the higher ed space. I typically focus on K-12, but safety will also be a big one.
Christine, that's a great overview. So thank you for kind of giving us the landscape. I want to follow up on a couple of those because you touched on some interesting aspects of these debates. And one on technology in schools, it seems to me that issue can often be framed as kind of either or. There was, I would say, within the last, 10 years or so, there's There's kind of been a rush for being pro-technology and putting devices in schools. I know there's been debate at times about iPads or Chromebooks or things like that as resources for students in classrooms or at home. So there's a sort of a track record of, we recognize that technology can be an asset. But then now with these conversations about maybe limiting some of that in the classroom, sometimes I hear other people kind of frame big tech as sort of the bad guys or the enemy. And, setting aside maybe some of the nuanced debates that are valid to have there, is it fair to say that this kind of approach is Utah sort of leading out in a way to find the balance between how can we leverage technology in a way that's productive, but balance it with minimizing distractions or harm, especially to kids? Seems like all these new technological advancements, we're still figuring out how to get the benefits and minimize the negatives as a society. Are some of these bills sort of a step in that direction in your mind?
I think they are. Here's the key that I think whenever I think of technology and education, the biggest pitfall is when something is promoted as a um, silver bullet, so to speak, right? That this will fix everything if we could just get devices in the classroom. If we could just get this one, this one unique thing in the classroom. Um, those have almost never panned out, right? It takes a lot of training, it takes a lot of understanding, and there's also downsides and risk, student privacy of data. So a lot of things come up. And so I think it's just a natural thing to have bills that come out and kind of temper some of these trends. And I don't think typically that policy is super linear, that we just chart the path, we know exactly where we're going, but sometimes it's a little bit of a pendulum swing. We embrace this, we see the problems, so we, put forward bills like we are this year. Um, and so I think, though, that Utah is uniquely positioned to strike the right balance. We're a little bit less afraid of bringing together opposing ideas. We're not so in the zero sum mentality. So I do have a lot of hope that we'll get it right. We want to embrace whatever power and potential that technology has, but we're also pretty aware that it has its limitations and its risks. So it'll be really interesting to see where this lands.
Well, Christine, let's take a quick break. When we come back, I want to follow up on the literacy issue, because there are some pretty, kind of surprising or concerning stats that I saw reported recently about that, and then the debate over school choice, education choice as well. So we're going to take a quick break, going to follow up on those items after this break. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn. We're talking with Christine Cooke Fairbanks, the Education Policy Fellow here at Sutherland Institute, about a preview for the legislative session. Before we get back into the conversation, I want to remind you, if you like what you're hearing today, subscribe to Defending Ideas wherever you get your shows, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. Just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe, and also find us at defendingideas.org. Christine, you mentioned a couple of things before the break. I want to ask you about this issue of literacy rates and absenteeism. There was some recent news coverage about the literacy rate for K-12 students. I wonder if you can comment on kind of what's been discussed recently and why that's such an issue that's topping the news here in Utah.
Sure. So recently there was a Kemsey Gardner report that showed that about 50% of students in Utah, K through third grade, are not reading at grade level. So they don't have reading proficiency. And that's startling, because usually that problem is one that just kind of gets compounded over time. I mentioned in the last segment that there is this kind of idea in education where the first few years you learn to read, and then the rest of your education you read to learn. And so without that foundation, really being there, education in general will be difficult. And so people are right to pay attention and to see this. I would say it not that we would ever just be okay with the fact that this is happening nationally, what that means for Utah. It means everyone needs to work on this. But it is something that is not unique to Utah. I do think most people do attribute it to um, COVID-19 and the struggle to get kids back where they need to be. But still, it's alarming, right? So it's worth the time. I know there's at least one bill file that's open that looks at literacy coaching. I feel very confident there's going to be more on this. Like I said, there is backing from the governor and his different literature. He's put out budget recommendations and things like that. So I think that we'll see more on that.
You mentioned absenteeism earlier. Are those two connected somehow? Is the high rate of literacy concern, or I guess the rates of those who are not reading at grade level, is that connected to absenteeism?
So that's a great question. As like a direct connection, I don't have the data to that. I couldn't speak to that, but it certainly I think looped in the conversation. There was this recent symposium in Ogden where a lot of state leaders, including the governor, were speaking, and one of the issues that was also discussed in this literacy symposium was chronic absenteeism, and this is another really big national challenge. So in Utah, though, specifically pre pandemic, I think it was like 12% of students were chronically absent. Today, it's almost 1 in 4. It's like 24%. Um, and so that's a big jump as well. And it's worth diving into exactly how is being chronically absent affecting these different scores. I think we can definitely say that it suggests that that's part of the problem. Chronic absenteeism is massive. Is massively complex though, because how do you get students into class? There's so many barriers. It could be a family issue. It could be a transportation issue. It could be a boredom issue. It's hard to say what's really at the root of it. And I think that's the biggest issue. If you could understand exactly what was causing it, maybe you could throw some interventions that way. But I think it's still a little bit of a mystery. And so that's why I think people are continuing. The focus this year, I should say, is a lot on data. So I think that would be worthwhile.
Christine, one of the other things you've mentioned is this ongoing debate, if you will, about the idea of education choice. You mentioned, of course, that issue continues to kind of play out in the courts, but it's also being discussed during the legislative session, this coming session, or at least slated to be discussed. Can you go into a little bit more detail? But you mentioned that there are some efforts to sort of decouple some of the legislation that passed before. Maybe just give our audience a recap of the broad strokes of the legislation that created the Utah Fits All Scholarship Program, and now what's going to be debated about changing that law.
Yeah, so for a long time, Utah legislators, individuals have put forward a more comprehensive or universal education choice proposal, which would allow students to take funding and go to different private schools or use it for home-based education. And so in that case, they would spend it on materials and learn at home. But um, in 2023, that was only able to pass because it was coupled with a teacher salary. So a different iteration had been put forward. The governor said, we need to support our teachers and make sure that they have, a livable lifestyle being teachers. And so when those two were put together, it was able to pass the legislature. But even at the time, um, especially from, I would say, maybe the education establishment and teachers groups didn't love that compromise. They wanted them to be separate and looked at on their own merits. And so I think what you're seeing today is an attempt to rectify that in their mind. I would maybe use the word rectify or just to change it. And the status of the program as it's currently defined in law is up in the air, obviously, because it's being challenged in court. And so in the event that the program is found unconstitutional, I think people want to make sure that the salary piece stays. And so I think that's where it's coming from. And along with bills that would decouple the salary from the program, there are some other proposed bills to align different education choice programs. So the Carson Smith Opportunity Scholarship and the Utah Fits All Scholarship, to give them similar definitions in some cases, and to just make sure that they're aligned in important ways. There are other bill files that would make some minor amendments, and there's at least one other that is open, but there's no text that's public yet. But I think we can anticipate seeing more legislation to make some refinements, some amendments, some that might be friendly to the program, some that might not be as friendly to the program in general. But that conversation will just continue. I think education choice is far from being over. We've had a lot of really impressive years nationally and in Utah. Um, but the reason why education choice is just so important is because it's connected to and stems from this more fundamental idea that parents have the right to guide their children's upbringing. And part of that is their education. And so I think just there's been a massive cultural shift where we say we understand now that that means parents want choices. Um, and just on a personal level, I know a lot of people that are homeschooling. I recently started doing a kind of a little mini homeschool co-op for preschool for my daughter. And I just think the idea is out there. People are interested. And so I think legislation will continue to refine and kind of stay in this space a little bit this year. And then we'll see what the impact is on the program generally in Utah.
Hey, Christine, I want to make an observation, but tell me if I'm wrong in this perception that I assume the efforts to decouple the teacher salary increase with the Utah Fits All Scholarship Program is the argument that the UFA program is flawed or wrong or a threat to public education in some way? I know those are some of the arguments that have come up before, and so there's an interest to decouple. At least that's a perception, that the only reason to decouple those things, and again, maybe this is wrong, but the only reason to decouple those things is if some folks view the school choice scholarship program itself as not in line with our education system. And I recall that was something that you've written about and spoken about, and a message that was compelling to me, that this is another instance where we have such an either-or mentality. There are those who say that, well, an education choice program is antithetical to the public education system. There's this argument that it's, public ed, the traditional K-12 schools, is the only or the best way to teach our kids. And even though most students in the state use that option, as you've said before, I think that the compelling message is that this is another instance where Utah is saying we're kind of rejecting the either-or polarizing arguments and saying that as a state, we can support both because we need both, and putting funding into our teachers to raise their salaries and into this UFA program, to me, signaled that both of these things are vital components of a holistic education system. If there are folks who just reject that idea, is that why they'd want to decouple it, or am I kind of off base there?
Well, I think philosophically, they can make sense together, right? That you can advance both visions or types of education at the same time and let families make those choices. And so I think, again, from a philosophical perspective, I resonate with that. I'm sure there are others that say, no, they don't belong together. But I think on a practical matter, right now with the program being in question, there's a segment that says, okay, that's a question mark. I don't want the salary to be a question mark, right? The salary increase to be a question mark. So let's preserve that. That is my assumption based on where everything is in this debate so far. And so from a logistical, strategic standpoint, it makes sense that you'd want to preserve that.
Well, Christine, we need to take one more break. When we come back, I want to get into some other things you've written about in this piece and in prior pieces, and we'll include the link in our show notes, obviously, to your Insights blog piece here at Sutherland that gives this preview for the session. But when we come back, I want to get into issues of open enrollment and kind of these other broader principles of parental rights in guiding the education of their kids, and how that does or should manifest in the way we debate these education bills this session. So we'll do that right after the break. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm Nic Dunn, and we're going to continue our conversation with Sutherland's Christine Cooke Fairbanks about what the Utah legislature is going to debate on education policy this coming session. And a quick reminder, if you're liking this episode, make sure you are subscribed to Defending Ideas. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. Search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. You can also find us at defendingideas.org. Hey, Christine, to round out the conversation, I want to ask you about kind of some themes that you have talked about and written about consistently. And I remember even having an episode where we talked with the governor's education advisor, and I think it's helpful to kind of recenter or reground all of us, especially when we're going into a legislative session, in what are the core principles that we ought to be advancing when we have these kinds of debates. For example, you've written a lot about the role of parents directing the education of their kids. You've done some studies on open enrollment as a component of that. So maybe start there. Just when you think of parents sort of being the chief decision makers when it comes to how their kids are educated, what do we need to keep in mind as a state, and especially for our legislators as they're having these debates with respect to that key principle?
Yeah, and that's so important. I mean, we already have a statute that really clearly outlines the fact that parents are have the primary responsibility for educating their kids, and that the state has a secondary responsibility. And so it's through that lens that we should really be looking at all of these different policies. And um, so when we're talking about open enrollment, for example, in any issue, really, I think something that is so important is transparency, right? We want to see how something is working, what the numbers are, what the trends are, and then making sure that that transparency is really usable and understandable, not just for policymakers, but certainly for them, but also for parents. We want the parents to be able to be consumers themselves, where they can look at the data and make good decisions for themselves. So with open enrollment, we just know that there's a lack of transparency there. There's just a lack of information. And so we'd like to see the state have a reporting requirement, and then other things as well. So there is a requirement that parents have to get notified from a district if their student was accepted or not accepted, if they apply for open enrollment. But there's no requirement to explain why they were denied in the event that they were denied. And so we think a really great way of just bringing parents in is to explain, give a reason why they were denied. Maybe it's something they can cure in the future, maybe it's not. But that is also another piece of transparency. Something else that I think about often and, communicate with different ed leaders as well is there's the requirement, which is the bare minimum. And then there's the ideal, which you can use creativity or innovation to kind of reach for. So right now there is a lack of people meeting the requirements of sharing some of this data. And then there are some districts or schools or leaders that not only meet it, but pursue it in a way that makes it really parent friendly. And it's clear that they're inviting parents in. So we like to highlight those as well. But another thing, I think this comes up with the private education choice discussion as well, is this issue of accountability. And this is so important. Accountability can be looked at in different ways. Financial accountability, and always we want to respect the taxpayers who are funding education, public education, and then accountability to parents who are the ones that are sending in their students to these different teachers or programs and saying, are you happy with this? Are you happy with the outcomes? And if not, move your kids elsewhere. And that's why choice of all types are so important to have them working well. Because if you want true accountability to parents, you need to give them choices and options to move if it's not working for them. So I think these things should really just kind of color how we look at a lot of different policy areas.
Christina, as we begin to wrap up here, I want to ask you if the legislature came to you and said, all right, Christine, we've got all these education bills slated for debate this session. What should we pass? What should we kill? What should we defer? Do you have any gut sense of recommendations for the legislature to say these are good bills, pass these are bad bills, don't pass these? And as some of them, if it kind of depends and you have to see how the debate shakes out, then that's fair as well. But just anything top of mind that you would say, legislature, please do this session on education policy.
Yeah. Um, I would start with protect parental rights, promote parental responsibilities wherever possible, increase funds for the education choice programs, increase transparency for any of the public school programs. Um, I think prioritizing literacy would be huge, making sure that's a top priority. And, this is a legacy issue for Sutherland, but it's also something that we see bills going public for civics education. And any time that we can support civics education and making sure that students are equipped to be participants in their government, full support of that. And so we see some movement in that area, including a bill actually that is really interesting that focuses on real world responsibilities and duties once you reach the age of majority, including, voting rights and registration, jury duty obligations, credit and debt, including student loans. I mean, those are just so important. And I personally felt that my education didn't prepare me for a lot of those things. So things like that were really valuable. But in general, I just think to look at it through this lens of how can we help parents make the best choice for their student in terms of education.
Christine, I'm reminded of amusing memes that I've seen on social media over the years of, folks saying that, well, I did, in high school, I didn't learn how to file my taxes or do these other kind of adult life skills that you're talking about, but I had to learn algebra, and my teacher always said, you're not always going to have a calculator with you, so you need to learn this. And they say, well, we have smartphones now, so we do have a calculator, but I still don't know how to do these other things in kind of adult life. And they're funny and amusing to that extent, but I think to your point, it's education that can further and better equip young people to be healthy, contributing, civically engaged members of society can make some good sense. So it's exciting to hear that kind of stuff progressing. In the couple of minutes we have left, is there anything we're missing? Anything else on your mind that ought to be on the radar of our audience, of our policymakers, of our parents here in the state as we go into this legislative session on education policy?
Sure. Funding is always an issue every year. There is a bill that is proposing to reduce the income tax rate a little bit. And obviously, that's a nuance for Utah because the revenue from income tax goes directly to education. And so that's something that people want to just be aware of. I don't know its likelihood for passage, but I don't know. But always, there's this idea that Utah is spending way less, usually at the very bottom of the states on per pupil funding, but a lot of people also show that we get great outcomes for for that. So we have a really high return on investment. So just keep an ear open for that debate about funding. As always, I kind of look at it through it's not just how much, but what are the outcomes? How are we spending it and what are we getting for that? So I think that would just be another piece to pay attention to.
Well, we will leave it there. A lot to track this session on education policy. Once again, that's Christine Cooke Fairbanks, our education policy fellow here at Sutherland. Christine, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to take a final break before we leave you with some talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back. The 2026 legislative session here in Utah is going to be full of education policy debates, and there's really one key takeaway from our discussion with Christine that's top of mind for me, and that's this. Utah explicitly recognizes that parents are the people chiefly responsible for the education of their kids. So any education policy debate needs to include that principle. And as Christine has said in the past, That means we need a strong spirit of parent-teacher partnership when it comes to K-12 schools. We also need a recognition that other ways of teaching kids, like those made possible by the Utah Fits All Scholarship, are also legitimate components in our overall education system here in Utah. Well, that's it for this episode of Defending Ideas. If you enjoyed this discussion, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can access previous episodes and watch or listen on your favorite platform. Don't forget to subscribe to Defending Ideas on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to get your shows. And please share this episode with a friend, family member, or coworker who may find it valuable. Lastly, if you want to support the broader work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, please make a contribution at sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. Thanks again for joining us on Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.